Today, we had a very important and very interesting meeting. That meeting saw a team from the opposition, led by the opposition leader, meeting with the team from the government to set the framework for future effective cooperation in responding to the protracted crime scourge, which has been attending Trinidad and Tobago for quite some time. The leader of the opposition is a prime minister of recent vintage, and I lead the government, having been in the opposition. So much of what was discussed today was very well known to both of us, coming from different perspectives. What for me is most interesting and important is that we have agreed to cooperate more effectively in the parliament, because it is in the parliament that the opposition's contribution to the government's effort can be best demonstrated. We discussed very briefly the attempts by legislation to respond to one of the major contributors to the upsurge in crime, and that is gang warfare, gang activity, and criminality through gangs. There was agreement that we try to do this by way of the existing legislation. And there's a point of view that there's some flaw in the legislation, and there's agreement that we will look at it to see whether it can be salvaged, amended, and represented. The whole question of the police ability to gather information, it was agreed that that is an area of absolute effectiveness that has to be there. Otherwise, the police will continue to be largely ineffective. But insofar as there's parliamentary assistance required, we have to come to a point where the opposition can provide the support to the government as required. So the discussion going down that line eventually came to the point where we have agreed that the parliamentary committee which currently exists, where the government, the opposition, and independents meet in treating with legislation, can be used and must be used to prepare the ground for common purpose before we get to the parliament floor. The government agreed to share with the opposition from early the work on its way to the parliament. And the opposition agreed that it will receive that approach, receive that work. We'll deal with it in committee and come to the parliament with some of the potential hurdles removed so that we can more easily cooperate in the parliament. A lot of specifics were mentioned because today was mainly a day for mention. And the Attorney General will, after I speak to you, the Attorney General will tell you what these areas of mention are. But we have agreed to have that committee in the parliament chaired. The government agreed to have that committee chaired by an independent senator, so as to ensure that the political acrimony, if I may use that word, that may exist between opposition and government doesn't form part of the chairing of this committee, and will encourage both sides in the parliament to move more effectively towards legislation. We are hoping that the relationship between parliamentarians can be improved dramatically in a body of mutual respect and responsibility, so that we can discharge our duties to the electorate, people we represent, more effectively. There's agreement that we need to improve in that area. And all of this might only be talk. The visit today might only be a sham. It is only when we get to the Parliament and we effect the turning of the page, as mentioned in the meeting today, that we will know if today has really borne any fruit. The government which I lead has committed itself to an opposition which was in government when the opposition which I led voted for a budget brought by that government. And that is the spirit in which we look forward in going to the Parliament. We also identified that there is a requirement for resources in the Parliament and resources in the opposition office to ensure that we can do what needs to be done in preparing legislation. For example, one thing came up for mention. We agreed that the government and the opposition sees eye to eye with respect to carrying out certain aspects of the law, but that has not been done because there are one or two points of differences, and the AG may mention that when he comes to talk to you. We agreed to meet in the committee in Parliament specifically to work out our differences with a view to coming to a position in the Parliament where we can agree on what is to be legislated. So there's a lot of mention of agreement. It is now for us to proceed to the Parliament and effect it, and it is only then that we will know that the parliamentary composition and the parliamentary collaboration, as promised by this meeting, can bear the fruit and the promise can be realized. I must say that I am very happy for the opportunity to have met with the opposition in this way. But it is not in the Prime Minister's office that collaboration with the opposition will take place. It was a good opener. It was a good opportunity for us to say that things aren't happening the way it ought to, and the criminals are getting the best of all of us in the country. But until we have this collaboration in the Parliament, it will still remain a promise. But I'm optimistic, I'm hopeful that the collaboration that we discussed this morning and the willingness to work on legislation and other kinds of cooperation, that if we take that to the Parliament and actualize it, that we will be in a much better place than we were when we awoke this morning. So I'll ask the AG to be specific now on what we actually touched on and what was said to us and what we've said to the opposition on those specific matters. And you can see what we're taking to the Parliament and what structures we're going to put in place in terms of getting a greater involvement of our parliamentary colleagues on the opposition benches in the preparation of a response that can be a contribution to our national fight against crime and other matters. Thank you very much for the moment. I'll sit and the AG will continue.
Good day, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to give you a little bit more of the particulars of this morning's meeting. We had the pleasure of having the team of the opposition led by the leader of the opposition. She was accompanied by Dr. Moonilal, Ms. Ramdial, Senator Mark, Senator Ramdeen, and Senator Hadid. We were pleased to receive inquiries as to the state of operationalization of certain of the laws that are already in effect, which we met unoperationalized, including things, for instance, to deal with DNA, electronic monitoring, the prison's rules, etc., all of which we have in a significant and advanced state of physical operation, and which we intend to give further particulars of both in the Parliament and out of the Parliament to show where we are in the several months that we have held office so far. The leader of the opposition was pleased to list a few areas which coincidentally matched up with a number of things which we had on the record. In particular, if we can separate it out, some improvements to the criminal justice system, for instance in relation to preliminary inquiries and the speed at which trials move. We were specifically pleased to receive the inquiries which matched up with a lot of what we are doing, and we were able to provide the opposition with a list of 16 items which we will pass out to you as the media corps, and those 16 items were just a snippet of some of the matters which we have as very urgent priority matters. They can be separated out into improvements to the criminal justice system and, very importantly, taking the profit out of crime. We are convinced that many of the laws stand on the books of Trinidad and Tobago and don't have the kind of impact into crime. And we feel that it is very critical for us as a country to go behind the money, because it is money which floats crime. We were very pleased in that regard to bring forward the discussion, by way of mention, to foreign terrorist fighters, to the issue of bail amendments in particular, to improvements to the Proceeds of Crime Act, the Financial Intelligence Unit Act, customs amendments, improvements to the motor vehicle and road traffic legislation, the Income Tax Act to be improved, the associated realm in gambling, gaming and betting, insurance, very importantly, to civil asset forfeiture. We, on the criminal justice side, were very happy to also include the indictable offences preliminary inquiries, the square abolition of preliminary inquiries, the abolition of trials by jury, the improvements to be had on the criminal procedure, plea discussion and plea arrangement, plea bargaining bill, the finalization of whistle protection, and very importantly, the unmasking of beneficial ownerships. That is, to know who the real owner behind companies are, etc. We also had the opportunity to squarely mention the issue of FACTA, and that is the reciprocity of information with the United States, which is the most imminent of the FACTA bills, and which you would have heard in discussion by the Bankers Association. And we indicated a process of engagement which includes exactly what the Prime Minister has said, that is a joint approach, one at the parliamentary level, including the Joint Select Committee on National Security, but very importantly, in what can be described as the pre-legislative march, by having the opposites identified to each other, for instance, Attorney General with the person who is shadowing the Attorney General, in direct association or contact, to deal with matters which are in the pre-legislative stage. Very much that involves the Legislative Review Committee. So it is opening the doors to sharing a bit more information, certainly soliciting the views so that we know early in the equation what will or will not be objectionable, and improving that process of communication. Just to add to what the Honourable Prime Minister has put on the table, as an opposition, we were very comfortable with supporting approximately 92% of the bills that came forward by the then government, now opposition. And the Honourable Prime Minister made the very relevant point that one can agree happily in the Parliament on how one approaches the law, and that is not something which can discern you or prevent you from having a square political battle. Notwithstanding the fact that we had 92% support in the Parliament, we of course went on to a general election, and the result is as it was. So we do believe that this cooperative approach in information sharing, in the manner in which we engage each other, in having designated people to receive and communicate with each other, will redound to the best interests of our country. We will be reporting on the operational improvements that we have already effected. We will be dealing with the legislative improvements which we suggest. We believe that improvements to the criminal justice system, and very importantly, to taking the profit out of crime, are significant tools in the arsenal that we can use as a society in the fight against crime and criminality. Thank you very much. I'll invite the Honourable Minister of National Security just to give you a few further updates on some of the operational and other aspects that we are treating with.
Pleasant good morning, members of the media and the listening public of Trinidad and Tobago. I just wish to bring you up to date on matters that were brought before us this morning by the Leader of the Opposition and her team in terms of what they refer to as low-hanging fruit. And we want to give you an update that they mentioned with respect to joint border patrols. Joint border patrols have been in action for quite some time, and they involve members of the Defense Force through the Trinidad and Tobago Coast Guard, the Trinidad and Tobago Air Guard, and of course we have instilled also land-based patrols with respect to the joint coastal patrols in the rural areas using the Trinidad and Tobago Regiment, elements of the Trinidad and Tobago of the Customs Services, and also the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service. But additionally, you recall some time ago that I mentioned that we have in fact put together a very high-powered team that dealing with the concept of the Joint Border Protection Agency, which is an agency deemed to bring together all the institutions and agencies that treat with ports, both airports and seaports. And that team comprises Mr. Fitzroy John, former Comptroller of Customs, Mr. Herman John, former Chief Immigration Officer, Mr. James Filbert, former Assistant Commissioner of Police, Mr. Ramesh Lachmidiyal, former Director of the Civil Aviation Authority of Trinidad and Tobago. And that team has been going relentlessly, engaging all the various agencies, not only customs and immigration and so on, but also the airports and the seaports of Trinidad and Tobago. And what that agency is designed to do is really to bring together a common operating picture, a situation awareness, to deal with what penetrates our borders, both our seaports, our airports, to ensure that we have that common operating picture to effect operations effectively and efficiently. So that we have been progressing to a great deal insofar as that measure is concerned, and we will be able to bring to bear to the Joint Select Committee that has been proposed that the Honourable Prime Minister mentioned as we progress at the level of Parliament as we go forward. Another area that they mentioned has to do with the question of the Forensic Science Centre, in particular the DNA. We have in fact started the recruitment process for a DNA custodian, and that is in progress right now. We have engaged the United Kingdom, the United States with respect to how do we treat with the DNA bank and so on. Additionally, you have heard some time ago the Honourable Prime Minister when he came back from the meeting in Jamaica, where he saw and he witnessed a facility taking place with the university in Jamaica, which was constructed with assistance by the Chinese government, dealing with the whole question of DNA. And we in fact will tend to model that to see how best we can take from that images, what has been done out there, and use it to our advantage here in Trinidad and Tobago. So we continue to build in so far as the whole question of DNA, the DNA custodian and the DNA bank is concerned. So that again is progressing quite nicely. The other issue that was raised had to do with the whole question of intelligence and intelligence gathering. And the opposition leader mentioned the question of the development of the National Intelligence Agency. Now, if you recall, when we restructured the Strategic Services Agency, part of that restructuring had to do with the National Intelligence Agency. And I want to draw a reference as we go back. The question of the National Intelligence Agency was developed in 2008-2009 by the then PNM administration, which came out of the General Ross report. It was one of the areas that was highlighted under the General Ross report to develop the National Intelligence Agency, where we bring together a sort of coordinated approach utilizing all the intelligence agencies within Trinidad and Tobago, namely the Special Branch, the Criminal Gang and Intelligence Unit, the Defense Force Intelligence Agencies, and all the intelligence agencies, so that we have, again, a coordinated approach to treating with intelligence that can inform operations. And in the restructuring of the Strategic Service Agency, we have placed the National Intelligence Agency under the strategy. So it gives it a sense of legitimacy. So right now, that intelligence agency is in fact acting as a fusion center that informs operations. So again, that is also in progress. The other area has to do in terms of utilizing the National Operations Center. And again, the National Operations Center, which again has been placed in the Strategic Services Agency, is the home or the house in which all operations would be placed and then fed into the various agencies of the state. So I'm saying this to you that in terms of what the opposition brought to us, these are actions that have already been taken at iron stage right now. But as we go forward, we are now will be put in a position where we can inform the Joint Select Committee so that we have a monitoring role and an implementing role as we go forward, stating what we are doing to treat with the issues of crime insofar as those are concerned. And I thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
At this stage, the Prime Minister will take a few of your questions.
Prime Minister, could you indicate the...
Before you start the questions, I guess some of you might be a little confused by now as to what really happened this morning. Basically, what we have done this morning is to lay out a pathway for execution at the Parliament. A lot of what you would have heard there coming from the Attorney General are items of work on various important pieces of legislation that will make their way to and through the Parliament, probably item by item. He mentioned 16 pieces. It may require 16 separate debates. But before they get to that stage, we are now talking about feeding it through proper committee analysis and collaboration before it comes to the Parliament. And the same thing, Minister Dillon spoke about these matters that are on the way. And what we are committing to do is sharing more of that information with the opposition and the country, so that this feeling that nothing is going on can really be addressed effectively. Something is going on, and in the absence of sharing that information, it is not surprising that we are being asked to do much of what we are already doing. But the new arrangement of getting the opposition a little closer to the information and to what is happening could address this sense of, well, maybe it is not happening when in fact it is happening. So that collaboration I spoke about should be able to bring the opposition more involved in knowing what the state is doing if their support is required in measures as we go forward. Now your questions.
Well, I wanted to ask you about this joint select committee. I take it this is a totally new body which will be formed?
No, it is not new. It is how it is going to be used.
Which of the JSCs is this?
There is a Committee on National Security, I'm sure, because we had just started treating with it, using it, before I was through the Parliament. I attended, I think, 2 meetings, and that committee had just begun to function, and it functioned initially by calling in the Commissioner of Police to deal with this total shutdown of policing, that matter. But we are saying now that committee is the place where the fight against crime, where the opposition and the government can meet, not just on television talking about matters like day of policing, but literally meeting on what the country needs to do, what legislation needs to be addressed, to be created, to be amended, where are the disagreements, and do that behind closed doors before we come to the Parliament. And that is how we intend to proceed. And we've gone further. We've said to the opposition that as we at the Cabinet operate the Legislative Review Committee, which prepares the legislation for the Cabinet, even at that stage, if we build the proper relationships with people in the opposition based on mutual respect and sharing of responsibility, we can even alert the opposition to what we are gestating at the level of the Cabinet, and then go forward when legislation takes shape into committee and then to the Parliament floor.
Okay, so essentially the chairmanship of the GST and National Security will now shift from...
It is now chaired by the government, and the government is prepared to have it chaired by an independent, where opposition and government chaired by an independent, but we are focusing on getting the benefits of collaboration, both in terms of identifying what needs to be done on the part of parliamentarians, and also speeding it through to the Parliament so it can get to those officers who are required to use the legislation. And let me just put out something to you. In 2009, the Parliament started working on the response to the gang situation in the country. You may recall, way back with Martin Joseph as minister, the question of the role of gangs and the emergence of gangs was identified as a major contributor to violent crime and murders in the country. So there was no legislation to treat with gangs and gang members and gang leaders and so on. So the Parliament then began to address the issue. That matter was well advanced, and the government changed before it came to the Parliament for legislation. The opposition then of the PNM and the new UNC government got together and completed it, and we established in law the anti-gang legislation. The government of the day then tried to use it, and then determined that there were needs for amendments. But those amendments had not taken place yet. Then Sunset came in, where the legislation, the bail bill, which paralleled the gang bill, wasn't supported in the Parliament. So this is where we are saying, if there are things to be done legislatively, then the parliamentarians must be able to agree to do it. And this is what today represents, an expression of a willingness on the part of the opposition to work with the government and vice versa, so that we will not be in a situation where, as we are today, we do not have legislation to treat with gangs, even though both sides have agreed and had agreed before that there needs to be legislation to respond to criminality in gangs in Trinidad and Tobago. And as I said earlier on, it is until we get to the Parliament and see what happens in the Parliament and behavior in the Parliament, only then will we know whether we've made progress today. But I'm very optimistic.
Prime Minister, earlier you said that it was identified that there were resource constraints in the opposition leader's office and in the Parliament as well to move forward with some of the work that you all would have discussed today. What kind of resources are we looking at?
Or technical support in particular, professional support. A lot of what we are now saying that we are going to channel through the parliamentary committee as the work to be done would put a lot of strain on the parliament staff. So we'll have to ensure that the parliamentary committees are properly staffed and available, and that time is allotted both from the parliament point of view and from the government's point of view and from the opposition point of view. And that will require getting more technical people involved, so that when what comes to the parliament will have been properly massaged and ready for enactment. And of course, if the opposition is to function effectively, the opposition office will also have to have the relevant staff to assist those who function at the opposition.
Prime Minister, I think you are to be commended for the approach you have taken to bring this legislative agenda.
Don't commend me yet.
Yeah. I think you should be commended.
Let us wait and see what happens in the Parliament.
I share your optimism, because I think that's the way forward. In the meanwhile, there are some low-hanging fruit, and I wonder whether or not we have addressed them. The majority of the crime is by guns. And I don't know whether our ballistics department in Trinidad and Tobago is working, because to date I've never heard the Commissioner of Police ever indicate that he has found one gun that has killed 3 people. The second thing is, drugs is a big problem. The last big haul of drugs in Monas Island, $600 or something million, nobody knows whether it was destroyed. Who is responsible for the destruction of narcotics that is caught by the police that no longer forms part of any legal ramification?
Well, the last question is easy to answer. The police is responsible for appropriately destroying not just narcotics but firearms, which have been taken out of circulation. What you are touching on there is the need for more transparent reporting by the police service. That is an area that we have been pressing, and that falls squarely into what we have just been addressing, which is that divisional commanders and the Office of Commissioner of Police must become more communicative with the population. Otherwise, cynicism will take root and probably become the order of the day. Because there's suspicion in your question, and I've heard this before, that some of the drugs and some of the arms and ammunition could be recirculating. And the only way one can properly, effectively address that is for the police, the Department of the Police, to properly communicate transparently with the public to win the confidence that what is supposed to happen is in fact happening. The destruction of firearms which are too old or are coming from crime, the destruction of drugs and destruction of fields, it be done to satisfy the public that there is no revolving door. Right? So we are hoping that there will be a new paradigm on all fronts, not just the Parliament. You would have heard earlier in the week, as Prime Minister, who holds the office of Chairman of the National Security Council, where I met with the leadership of the police service and had a frank discussion with them as to how the government sees the role of the police service in 2016. And we expect to see the fruit of that as the police service becomes more open and you get more information and they become more effective in discharging their duties. I don't have that information. Maybe somebody else does in this room, but I can't pretend to have that information to answer that question about whether ballistics are in fact being utilized in such a way that it can be reported. But I have the confidence that if that is happening, that the police service can have an answer for you. And you having raised the question, I hope next time you meet the Commissioner of Police or some senior police officer at some divisional head, that question could be put to them so they can answer. That is not a question that I can answer today. Yes.
Mr. Prime Minister, some mention was made of reviewing the criminal justice system. Have you all identified any areas in particular? I know that there have been mentioned before about foregoing the preliminary inquiries and looking at jury cases and such. Was that discussed?
Well, yes, it came up this morning, and the opposition leader indicated a willingness to support the abolition of trial by jury. But I must say that that conversation is not complete, because there are some points of view that it may not be done in totality. It can be done partially, but it is an area that needs to become part of the arsenal, because the very attack on witnesses by the criminal element has made the use of the jury system and an effective jury pool part of the problem to be solved. Because criminals are not just targeting their enemies, they are targeting bystanders who would have seen the crime, and the witnesses are in grave danger. And so the whole idea of removing trial by jury is part of the consideration in responding to treating with the criminals who end up before the court. The whole question of preliminary inquiries. We have seen evidence being presented to the public, but people at the preliminary inquiry after how many years now? 16 years, 10 years, the preliminary inquiry. So we are not getting, justice is not being served. It's not being perceived to be done, and it's not being on time. So we have to try to get justice without the intervening delays at the preliminary inquiry, and the opposition indicated a willingness to support that. As a matter of fact, it was acknowledged this morning that the occurrence of the infamous Section 34 would have prevented us from going down the road of treating with that particular omnibus bill, the indictable offences bill, and the opposition indicated a willingness for us to start over and get done what that bill had intended to do, which is to help us accelerate cases through the and declog the court system. So that came up, and we have some commitment to work on that with some dispatch.
Prime Minister, over the years, you have accused a number of the opposition members of being corrupt and other criminal activities, including some people in that very meeting. So why should the public then be confident that they will seek to stem crime?
As I have said, and I'll say it again, what happened here this morning is not a solution to anything. It is a commitment to go along a certain pathway. Just be a little patient and let us see what happens at the place where it is to be effected, and that is the Parliament. Who the opposition selects as its team to talk to the government is not for the government to determine. The government selected its team and the opposition selected its team. It is for the population to come to its own conclusion as to who makes up the government and who makes up the opposition.
Mr. Prime Minister, can you tell us if the issue of capital punishment was discussed this morning?
Yes, it was mentioned. The opposition raised the question of hanging. We had a short discussion as to where we are on this issue. In short, it is that the government and the opposition are of the view that capital punishment should remain on our books and should be the effective response to particular crimes. That being the case, we are divergent in our views, where this government, when in opposition and is still of the view, as advised by thorough legal research, that we are only allowed to carry out capital punishment in Trinidad and Tobago as reaffirmed by the Privy Council because of the savings law which took place at independence. If we interfere with that law and create new conditions to the law, we open the door for the Privy Council to permanently, effectively abolish capital punishment in Trinidad and Tobago. What the Privy Council has said, the two things. One, that capital punishment is lawful in Trinidad and Tobago. The Privy Council has affirmed that. Whether you are a supporter of capital punishment or not, the bottom line is the Privy Council, our highest law, has affirmed that that law is lawful and that capital punishment can be carried out in Trinidad and Tobago. Secondly, the Privy Council has outlined the conditions under which it can be done, and that is that all the proceedings must be concluded and upon conviction that the capital punishment is carried out within a 5-year period. So it is for the state then to be able to meet the Privy Council conditions. Where we have a divergence of view with the opposition is that they were proposing new arrangements for capital punishment. And we are saying that the minute we do that, it means that the Privy Council will then permanently abolish it. The reason why they have not abolished it so far is because of the old law, which is beyond the reach of the Privy Council. We agree to meet in the stream of meetings as we are expecting and to discuss this to some point of hopeful agreement as to what advice we will take. So the matter will come up in the near future.
Doctor.
Yes?
Dr. Rowley, Sterling Henderson. Oh, sorry.
There was nothing mentioned with regards to errant police officers and the issues of the mechanisms where they get away scotch-free, if you want to call it that, against the background that they get sent home, they get paid, and the same process like the preliminary inquiry, it takes 15 years to find it.
Okay, that matter did not come up today in the meeting with the opposition, but it did come up in the meeting of the National Security Council and the police leadership. And it was one of the matters that the government raised in the context that the Parliament has given the authority to the Commissioner of Police to carry out disciplinary action against all police officers below the rank of Deputy Commissioner. And it is for the Commissioner of Police and the police leadership to rid the police service of any policeman or woman, any officer on the public payroll who fall beneath the standard expected of the public who carry out the name and the uniform of the police officer. That came up when the National Security met with the police leadership. And we went further. We told the police leadership that the taxpayer is better off having removed miscreant officers, that if such officers eventually go to the court and complain, as is their right, and if they win the case in the court, taxpayers are prepared to pay the compensation than to have them in the service polluting and criminalizing the service. That matter came up and was one of the matters that we hope the police leadership will take as part of their day's work.
Good afternoon, Dr. Rowley.
Yes.
Understanding that you're optimistic following the meeting, a question that came up was why there wasn't a joint press conference between the opposition and the government. Another thing is, following, there was a bit of an expectation. Also, you had requested an agenda. I'd like to know if that agenda was presented by the opposition and how it was treated with in terms of their recommendations. And two, did the issue of a substantive police commissioner come up?
A lot came up in the hour and a half, but as I said, a lot of it was mentioned. We thought it was, as a matter of fact, because we are speaking individually to the country, and because the country is paying so much attention to this particular development today, we thought it was best for both sides to speak to the country and let the country determine from what we have said whether in fact the country could repose any confidence going forward. Because I want you now to compare what we have said here with what the opposition would say, and I'm sure you'll be in a better position to determine whether in fact we have made connection and we've made progress, as against some kind of a hastily put together feel-good joint press conference which doesn't really indicate the depth of our commitment. So you go now, see what the government has said, see what the opposition has said, and you'll be in a good position to know what to expect going forward. The other matter you mentioned was the agenda. Yeah, what was asked, because we were having a meeting, I had asked the opposition leader to just indicate what areas we can discuss, which they will come with, and they did give us, I think it was 5 items. The main one was the legislative support, and also the other one was collaborative partnership in the parliament. Those we put both together. And then there was also administrative, which is some of the things about the police you're talking about, and other, there were 5 items, but the main one was legislative and parliamentary structure that we could put in place to go forward. And the commissioner came up, and I was able to inform the opposition leader, who was of the view that the matter having gone to the court, and the court having cauterized certain parts of it and allowed certain parts to stand, it is now open to the Police Service Commission to proceed to start the process so that we as a country could end up appointing a commissioner of police. I was able to advise the opposition leader that my understanding is that the Police Service Commission is attempting to get the process going, but there are obstacles in the way. Those obstacles seem to multiply. It's like a hydra. As you cut off one head, another one comes on. And this is entirely frustrating to the government, because we have to watch the Independent Police Service Commission saying to us it is proceeding to do it and receiving reports that it is not happening, because somewhere within the public service there's authority which is frustrating the efforts of the commission. We will stay on the job relentlessly until we get it done. One of the nonsense that came to the cabinet from the public service was a reluctance to move forward unless the government provides $6 million to allow a local firm to commit to evaluate the applications. That figure of $6 million was the cost of doing it through Penn State abroad, and a whole set of hoops and costs. That was what we eliminated by changing the order and confining the search to using a local firm and confining the search to nationals at home or abroad. Only the Public Service Department could justify why you require $6 million to apply for a job and have somebody evaluate the applications. My understanding is that the latest hold-up is that the public service is taking the position that some important part of the process must be done by the Central Tenders Board. Great. But then elements of the Central Tenders Board are not put in place or to be put in place by the same people who are saying it must be done by the Central Tenders Board. And it makes you wonder whether, and I'm coming to this now as brought to it by your question, whether there are certain inherent conflicts of interest in this particular matter and whether the obstruction is deliberate. The government is very frustrated on the fact that with all the will in the world, there seems to be no pathway towards appointing a commissioner of police who will effectively move on certain particular matters which are before the commissioner of police. I am reluctantly coming to the conclusion that there are obstacles in our way which may have their root in a conflict of interest. And I say no more for the moment. One more question.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Prime Minister, has any kind of time frame been imposed by yourselves on yourselves as to when you want to see the collaboration at the level you have spoken of really get going, and when you would like to see such and such legislation be put behind you? So that
well, the Parliament meets on the 9th, so we have agreed to meet immediately after the Parliament reopens on the 9th, and we have already agreed to share some information with the opposition, so the promise is on the way, and the outcome. We have a deadline to meet on one of these many, you call it factors, information to do with the banking system and to fight money laundering and complying with international standards within the country. There's a factor deadline coming up on 30th of September. We need to amend some law here which requires a 3/5 majority. We've put the opposition on notice that we are expecting their support. Failure to comply would have serious consequences for the country. And of course, the opposition indicated a willingness to look at it and to cooperate. So let's see when we get to the the AG and the opposition counterpart would be working on that. So the taste of the pudding will be in the eating in the Parliament.